Okay, let's dive right into this. Welcome to this explainer, where we're unpacking the incredible anatomy of the church. Usually, when we think about learning deep truths, we think of our eyes and ears, right? Like reading a book or listening to a speaker. But here's a really fascinating concept we're exploring today: how the Christian faith actually leverages all of our physical senses to reinforce profound spiritual realities. Through specific physical practices, the church brings invisible concepts right into the tangible world. To see how this all fits together, here's our roadmap for today. We're going to cover 1. The ordinances and sacraments. 2. Differing views on baptism. 3. Understanding the Lord's Supper. 4. How churches are governed. And finally, number 5, the mission of the church. Let's get to it. All right, section 1. The ordinances and sacraments. Let's look at how the Christian gospel is actually physically dramatized. So we call these dramatic, physical actions ordinances or sacraments. Basically, they're holy signs commanded by Jesus himself. Historical heavyweights like Augustine and Calvin, they describe them beautifully. They said if a sermon is the word spoken, a sacrament is the word made visible. They literally, intentionally hijack your sense of touch, your sense of taste, and your smell to make invisible promises feel totally tangible. Now, there are 2 foundational practices given to the church that actually do this. You've got baptism, which represents entry and cleansing, and then you have the Lord's Supper, which is all about ongoing communal participation. The idea here is that God doesn't just preach to your ears, right? He ministers to your entire physical body through everyday things like water, bread, and the fruit of the vine. Moving on to section 2, differing views on baptism. It is absolutely crucial to understand how different traditions globally interpret this first major ordinance. So, it kind of breaks down like this. On one side, we have traditions like the Roman Catholic, Lutheran, and Reformed churches, and they heavily practice infant baptism. But then on the other side, you've got the Baptist and non-denominational traditions that strictly practice believers' baptism, meaning they only baptize professing adults or older children, and almost always by full immersion in water, like going all the way under. Now, the underlying theology is what really shapes these practices. For instance, the Roman Catholic and Lutheran traditions hold a view known as baptismal regeneration. In this framework, the physical act of baptism itself is seen as a literal, miraculous means of grace. Just look at this quote from the Catholic Catechism. Baptism is viewed as the actual instrument through which a person is freed from sin and reborn. But notice the nuance here because it's fascinating. The Reformed tradition views infant baptism not as instant regeneration, but as a sign and seal of a covenant promise. It very much echoes the Old Testament practice of circumcision. It's basically a promise from God to eventually do what the water symbolizes. Meanwhile, the Baptist view sees the water strictly as a powerful, obedient symbol of a salvation and cleansing that has, already taken place in the believer's heart. And this brilliantly illustrates how different groups approach the exact same water. Okay, on to section 3, understanding the Lord's Supper. So, transitioning from how someone enters the church, let's look at how the church gathers corporately. Now, you might actually know this meal by a few different names. Some call it the Eucharist, communion, or the Lord's table. And here's a fun linguistic fact for you. The Lord's table is actually a metonymy. That's a figure of speech where a closely associated thing stands for the whole event. So just like hearing the White House made a statement really means the president made a statement, coming to the Lord's table means participating in the meal instituted by Christ himself. Now, what's really fascinating about this breakdown is the massive theological shift regarding what actually happens during this meal. Historically, we've got 4 main views. In the Roman Catholic view, the elements physically change and Christ is sacrificed. Over in the Lutheran view, the elements don't change, but Christ is physically present within them. The Reformed view argues for a really profound spiritual presence, but not a physical one. And finally, the Zwinglian view holds that the meal is purely a memorial, just remembering a past event. Let's take a quick deep dive into the mechanics of that Roman Catholic view, which is known as transubstantiation. This actually relies on ancient Aristotelian categories, specifically accidents and essence. The accidents, meaning the outward sensory appearance, well, they remain the same. It still looks and tastes exactly like bread and wine. But the essence, that invisible core reality, the spiritual DNA, if you will, is believed to miraculously transform into the actual body and blood of Christ. Now, in contrast to those physical sacrifices and visual pilgrimages, Martin Luther pushed back hard during the Reformation. He had this super provocative thought: the proper organs of a Christian man are his ears. Luther was really emphasizing the passivity of faith. To him, salvation was primarily an acoustic experience of hearing the gospel promise. Although, to be fair, he still deeply valued the sacrament as God coming down to us rather than us offering a sacrifice up to God. But regardless of the specific tradition, the theology of the supper is just incredibly multifaceted. It grounds the church by following a direct command. It looks back to the past as a memorial of history. It operates right now in the present by uniting the community and visually broadcasting the gospel. And, amazingly, it looks forward to the future. It's eschatological, meaning it forecasts the promised return of Christ and that final ultimate banquet. All right, Section 4, how churches are governed. We've looked at the sensory rituals, but how is this giant global body actually structured and organized? Well, again, we see a really wide spectrum. On one end, you have the highly hierarchical Roman Catholic and Episcopal model. This is built entirely on the concept of sacerdotalism and apostolic succession, where authority flows strictly top-down. The authority to oversee, to minister, and to forgive is believed to be passed down sequentially, literally from the Pope to the bishops and then directly down to the local priests. Moving away from that strict top-down structure, we find the Presbyterian or Reformed model. Think of this one as climbing a ladder of representative governance. It starts right at the bottom with a local session of elders who are elected by the congregation. Those local elders then send representatives regionally to a presbytery, and then those presbyteries send representatives up to the highest national council called the General Assembly. So it's a whole series of interconnected representative courts. And then, contrasting both the hierarchical and the representative models, we have congregational governance. This is your ultimate bottom-up approach, heavily favored by Baptist and independent churches. In this setup, there is no bishop or regional assembly that can dictate terms to the local church. The local congregation itself retains absolute, final authority over its budget, its beliefs, and its leaders. They run the whole shebang. But here is what you really should take away from this structural overview. Despite these massive differences in how authority actually flows, almost all Christian traditions share two biblical offices. You have the pastor, elder, or bishop, and they are tasked with spiritual care, teaching, and wisdom. And then you have the deacon, who is tasked with the service, logistics, and all the practical ministries. And that brings us to our final stop, Section 5, the mission of the church. We've explored the internal rituals and the structural anatomy, but how does all of this actually turn outward toward the rest of the world? So the crucial point is a church doesn't just exist to govern itself or perform rituals in a vacuum, right? Its daily existence is defined by 4 core activities. Worship is the supreme goal. Evangelism is the outward reach. Edification is the internal building up of believers. But it's this 4th pillar that so beautifully ties everything together, bringing the physical anatomy of the church right back to the physical needs of the world. We call this often overlooked 4th pillar diaconal ministries. Essentially, these are God-honoring ministries of mercy and social action directed specifically toward the poor, the hurting, and the vulnerable. It just goes to show that faith communities are designed to serve tangible, physical needs just as fiercely as they serve the spiritual ones. And guys, this isn't some modern invention, it's a historical mandate. Think about when the Apostle Paul met with Peter and the early church leaders in Jerusalem to confirm their global mission. They completely agreed on the theology. But look at Paul's summary in Galatians 2:10. They only asked us to remember the poor, the very thing I was eager to do. So social action was this equal, passionate partner to their worship and outreach. Which brings us to the end of our explainer today, and I want to leave you with a really profound question to ponder. How do the deeply personal, physical rituals of a church, the touching of the water, the tasting of the bread, the smelling of the cup, ultimately shape a global outward mission of mercy? Maybe, just maybe, it's because a community that is consistently taught to experience grace physically is perfectly wired to turn right around and physically deliver that grace to a hurting world. Thanks so much for joining me on this dive into the anatomy of the church. Keep learning, and I'll catch you on the next one.